Reineke, Tal, Governor, Mayor, veterans, students, friends, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I couldn't help, when I was sitting here thinking about Bess Truman in the hospital, and frail and ill, and I remembered a story told me about her by a man I expected to quote once, twice in this little speech, Mr. Dean Acheson, who described to me once an occasion when there was to be a White House diplomatic dinner of some importance. The list of the invited guests was sent to President Truman, who struck out one name, an ambassador from a country, I think, in East Europe, because he was convinced, or he had the notion in his head, that this man had somehow insulted his wife somewhere. So Dean Acheson had to go in to see the president, because this was a pretty important affair, to insist that the gentleman in question be invited after all. And he said to me, the president reached over in his desk, picked up a framed photograph and opened the back of it and showed it to Acheson, and the inscription read, "To Harry, this will get him to France and back again, signed Bess." And the president said to Acheson, "Any SOB that insults that girl is not welcome under my roof." But still they had to have the man at the dinner. It was just too important. So the next day, Acheson went back at the president, having in the meantime cooked up a little plot with Mrs. Truman. And while he's sitting by the president's desk in the Oval Office, the phone rings. It's Mrs. Truman asking to speak to the Secretary of State. So Dean Acheson picked up the receiver and sort of ad-libbed his end of the conversation. And as the president sat and listened, Acheson said, "Yes, very stubborn, yes, yes. Mule-headed, that's right. You mean too big for his britches." At that point, the president reached over and grabbed the phone and said to his wife, "I can't fight both of you. Let the SOB come." And that was something. Anyway, this is all a little overwhelming for me. You helped confirm me in the conviction as I grow old, like others of my generation, which is the Depression, the World War II, and the World Recovery generation. But in the end, of course, what really counts for anybody is not pop celebrity or money, but friendships, in the sense that one has done his best and in the course of it injured a minimum of his fellow beings. But the better purpose of this gathering, of course, is to remind Americans who have had too much of false prophets and uncertain trumpets in recent years of that Missourian who was once among us and who will be alive as long as there is in America, and Americans to tell its story. What was the special thing about Harry Truman, aside from that courage, which, as both Aristotle and Winston Churchill said, makes the other virtues possible? There was that rare quality known as common sense. It may be derided by many of the young and by certain types of intellectuals, but it does exist. It's the instinct for knowing what is likely to help and what is likely to harm. It's born of experience. It takes some living. Before the presidency ever fell on Harry Truman, he had lived much, he'd learned much. For one thing, he had learned who he was and where he came from, and he never forgot. He had learned and he never forgot what America came from, what it was and what its better angels always insisted it should be. I think that concept called the American dream was not just an abstraction to him, but a kind of a working agenda. After all, he had grown up right here, the very spot from which the brave and the trusting, the innocent and the naive, dreamers, all of them, had set out for the West and the unknown. And the building, the unfolding of America had for Truman, I think, a kind of biblical meaning. If a man can't go through a university of higher learning, then the next best thing, of course, in my view, is to saturate himself in the reading of history. For it's all there, the repeated lessons of what helps and what harms, what leadership is and what it isn't, what a civilized society can be and what it must do and feel to be civilized, what the true dangers are, how men will behave under given circumstances, and men change very little over the centuries. Mr. Truman must have sensed as a young man that no one can understand where his society is unless he knows where it has been. History is no perfect guide to present or future, but it's one of the few we have. And this is why Mr. Truman read history. That's why, incidentally, I tell young aspiring journalists they must read and read and read about the past if they are to try to report the present with any serious meaning. Well, this is called the age of information. Communication is a large part of this so-called post-industrial period. There are 1,000 new devices by which we are supposed to communicate better with one another, yet I don't think there's ever been a time of more widespread confusion and misunderstanding. That awkward word communicator was not in vogue in Mr. Truman's time. But that man was about the best communicator we've had in the White House in recent decades. Of course, he delivered many speeches very badly, unless, that is, he threw away the ghostwriter script and just let fly in his own style. And a lot of you will remember that. He resorted to none of the elegances or flourishes of the language. He never used a $12 word. He never thought of his voice as an organ to be played with artistry or artfulness. Yet I would say he was a great communicator because you knew exactly what he meant, because he always said exactly what he meant. Now, I've sat in enough radio and TV studios listening to presidential speeches and then tried to explain them in that dubious process known as instant analysis. It was a terrible problem with a man like President Nixon because he resorted to so many ambiguities. With Truman, you never had to try to read between the lines for hidden meanings. With him, plain speaking also meant exact speaking. Of course, this sometimes upset some apple carts, home and abroad. I remember once an aide to President Eisenhower saying to me that through all his press conferences, Mr. Eisenhower never caused the uproars that Truman had caused. And I replied, that's because Ike, at least on those occasions, never said anything. Truman always said something. He said and he did. His deeds are now carved in the rock of our history. Mr. Atchison once said to me about his job as Secretary of State that the Secretary was in luck if he worked for a president who would make decisions. And he was in clover if the president was right 51% of the time. Atchison was in four-leaf clover, and he knew it. I won't dwell on his deeds as president. They're part of the common knowledge as well as our common heritage. The more personal and intimate memories that come back again and again as one ages, which seem to me to have the most meaning. When he became president so suddenly, I was about to board a military transport in the middle of the night at Prestwick, Scotland. And the sergeant there told me that Roosevelt had died. I'd been out of the country a couple of years, and I could hardly recall the face of the senator, then Vice President Truman of Missouri. Then I rather faintly remembered doing a radio interview with the senator in Washington, and it had left no impression on me. I couldn't recall a thing that either one of us had said. And on the last morning of his presidency, I was standing outside the front entrance of the White House with an open radio microphone. President-elect Eisenhower's car drove up. He was to enter the White House and wait upon the man who was still the president in law and in fact. But it was the president inside who did the waiting. The president-elect did not emerge from his car. For an awful moment, I thought General Eisenhower might give a honk on the horn. Finally, General Eisenhower got out of his car just as President Truman emerged out the door, smiling as if nothing had happened. No doubt there are many things for which Missouri has had to forgive Kansas. That was one of them. Well, we have in this country a presidential system We can't get away from that. We should not. In reaction against the so-called imperial presidency a few years back, Congress has tried to make inroads on the presidential system. I'm pretty sure that Harry Truman, whatever the abuses in Mr. Nixon's time, would have opposed the Congress in this general movement. It is heady wine, the presidency of the United States. Certainly true that power corrupts. But what is not often recognized, because we've not had the opportunity often enough to recognize it, is that power can also ennoble. It depends upon the stuff of which the possessor of power is made from his beginnings. As that ancient Greek said, a man's character is his fate. The character of Harry Truman was not universally understood when he was in office. There were sides to him that even those of us who stood before his desk every week in those press conferences didn't quite grasp. That New England intellectual aristocrat who was so fond of the Missouri ex-judge and ex-haberdasher said to me in that interview sometime after Mr. Truman had died, I quote him, "He had a deeply loving and tender nature, though this," said Mr. Atchison, "was not the general impression of him at all." I had already learned this about Mr. Truman a few years before. I had asked for and received from him an inscribed photograph. And the inscription read, "Kindest regards to Eric Sevareid from his friend of long ago." And why those words of long ago? Because it was 10 years after his presidency that he signed that photograph. And any visitor looking at it would assume that we had been friends when he was in the White House. We hadn't been, not really, though he did listen to me on the radio at times. But he was trying with an exquisite sensitivity to make me feel that we had been friends in his days of power and glory. And once in his early retirement years, we sat up late in New York's Carlisle Hotel, and he talked about the past. The thing he was proudest of, he said, was none of the great decisions of public policy that he made as president. He was proudest of what he had done as a county judge, going about the state, rescuing scores of elderly men and women who had in effect been railroaded into mental hospitals and asylums by relatives or others who didn't wish to bother about them. That's what he talked about. And he talked about a recent lecture tour he'd made to schools and colleges. On one of these occasions, he took questions from a student audience in California. And one student got up and asked him what he thought of, I quote, "our local yokel Governor Pat Brown." Well, Mr. Truman castigated the young man with a reminder of what it takes to hold high public office successfully and what would happen to our system if public office fell into general disrespect. And then as he sat on that stage, Mr. Truman realized that he had humiliated that boy in front of his friends and teachers. A president had tongue-lashed him. That boy would bear that mark forever. So Mr. Truman had the boy brought to him back to the stage and talked to him very gently and asked him to send him a letter now and then about his progress through school. "People don't understand," Mr. Truman said to me, "the power of a president to hurt. The power to hurt. Had any president ever talked about that? Lincoln perhaps. And once, when the feebleness of age was just beginning to show, there was a grand dinner for the president at the Waldorf. It was my high privilege to be one of the speakers. I reminded that audience that in older days of war, a captain of artillery was a special and marked man, because no matter how the battle went, it was understood that it was his duty to die on his guns if need be. And I added that because he had always accepted this, Harry Truman, as president, had won his battles. I don't remember now the rest of what I had said that night, but as I finished, I felt a hand tugging my pants leg. I looked down to see the former president of this great republic looking up at me with tears in his eyes. Of course, I had a hard time finding my seat, but that moment I'll wear in memory like a medal. Now, I represent the news business, or trade or calling, or whatever it is properly to be termed. I've been in no other business in my life. Many presidents learned to dislike, even to detest that press corps, so-called, in Washington. I don't think Mr. Truman did, though I know that he occasionally thought we were damnably unconstructive. He understood that there will always be and must be an adversary relationship between government and the free American press. Of course, it goes too far at times, from one side or the other. As far as the press is concerned, I imagine this creative tension might slacken a bit if and when public officials admit mistakes of a serious nature and protest on those occasions, and they do occur, when they are overpraised in the press. That would be the day. Harry Truman had the character to do both. His sense of humility was genuine, not weakness or false modesty. Never for an hour did he confuse himself with the office. He was just its temporary occupant. Sometimes I wish a similar modesty were manifest in my own business, the news business. It would be graceful, maybe our saving grace. We're important, but we're not quite as important as we sometimes seem to think these days. There is a difference between the work of a journalist and that of a public office holder who must act and not only write and speak. Their responsibilities are of a different kind. The effect on history of those who act can be measured with some accuracy. The effect of those who write and speak, who influence, is not really measurable. And that is why the most successful journalist will not occupy a place in history equal to that of the most successful political, military, or industrial leaders. And that's why the failed journalist will not fall so low in history as the failed political, military, or industrial leader. I happen to love the news business and to believe not only that the American press, print and broadcast, is the best in the world, but absolutely indispensable to free government. There is a firstness to the First Amendment. There are powerful people now trying to chip away at it, some judges included. I think Harry Truman would want us to resist this, as we will. I think he would have agreed, as Jefferson did, that it's better that the press be at least a little bit irresponsible than that it be too prudent, too cautious, and fearful. Better for our people. Harry Truman knew that civil liberties, including that of the press, must be fiercely guarded because they have a special nature. They are defendable only as long as we still have them. They are their own defense. Should they be lost in this country, should the United States, the superpower, become as closed and paranoid as the other superpower, then surely global tensions would become unbearably explosive. We can protect those liberties, therefore peace, so I believe, only if we learn to trust each other more than we seem to be doing today. We must trust others, even those we think may wish us harm. We must, all of us, take this risk. That is what built this country, as anyone from these banks of this frontier river knows. Risk and trust. Thank you very, very much for your time.